Okay. So those are some examples of some scatter plots that you might see. But there's a couple of new different concepts that I want to go over. Just one is this idea of linearity. That's going to be very important to us. So linearity is just talking about how liney, how like a line it is, right? So I want you to know this distinction between linear and curvilinear. Right? So when you think about linearity, think about linear versus curvilinear. And when you think of strength, I want you to think of it as if we have, as if we're really talking about spread, right? So just translate that in your mind as spread. So if we have these dots, and they're a little bit spread around the line, right? So there's a little bit of spread here, right? And you could think of it as averaging all these little distances away from that line, right? Versus if you had something like this, that was much more widely spread around this line. Right? So there's a lot more spread going on here. And if I just added a few more out here, I would have even more spread, right? So when you think of strength, think of it as spread, right? And so I want you to think of it as, strong, moderate, or weak, right? So you could think of strength in those terms. And then finally, I want to introduce this concept of consistency that we really haven't had very much of until now. Consistency just means how consistent is that strength? Is it strong all the way through? Is it weak all the way through? Or is it inconsistent? So example graph might look something like this. This sort of starts off looking very linear, right? But then down here, there might be more variability, right? So here, you could see that if we drew a regression line, here we'd have very little spread, but here we'd have a lot of spread, right? So that would be, this would be inconsistent. So one is sort of constant spread versus inconsistent, right? And so an example of constant might be something like these, where it's pretty constant. This one is sort of less constant because there's this peak out here, but here there's less variability, right? So this is an example of constant. This is another example of inconsistent. So you want to think of this consistency as applying to strength. Is that strength consistent all the way through, or is it sort of different all the time? And just to point out something, in all of these graphs that I've drawn here, just by coincidence, I've drawn what are called negative associations, because as one variable, as we look at values that are greater on one of the variables, like for instance here, this variable seems to be very low. The value is very low here, right? And so these are all examples of negative associations. And one easy way you could visually see this is that they all have that negative slope where it's slanting this way instead of that way, right? Positive slopes would be that way. All right, so now let's talk about how to summarize a scatter plot. We've seen some of the different features of it, but here's how you sort of wrap your mind around a scatter plot. And I've sort of distilled it into 5 steps so that it'll be easier for us to sort of knock through all of them. first thing you want to do is identify the cases and the variables. Oftentimes people look at a scatter plot and they see the overall shape. They see, oh my God, it's a line, right? But then they forget what the dots are. It's sort of like seeing the forest but forgetting what the trees are, right? So first thing you want to do is identify what the cases are, and then identify what the variables are so that you know what you're talking about. Then you want to describe the overall shape. Talk about the linearity. If there are any clusters, you want to identify those. If there are any real outliers, you want to be able to identify those as well. Then you want to describe the trend, or you could think of this as the positive or negative association. So is it slanting to the positive side or slanting to the negative side, right? So you could think of this as going that way or going that way, right? And then step 4 is describe the strength. And for now, you could just think of it as eyeballing it, strong, medium, or moderate, or weak. But we'll talk about exactly how to do that later. And then any potential explanations for this relationship. Now, this is just, this is sort of an extra step. Sometimes you may not need this, but it's often helpful to do. And it's really critical that you remember not always causal. There might be a causal relationship, but not always. And it behooves us to think of potential explanations that are not causal. So why might they have this positive association? Why might these two variables have this negative association? And that's going to be really important for us to figure out. But it's good for us to think about, okay, maybe it's causal, but maybe it's not. And those are actually harder to think of sometimes because we sort of jump to the causal explanation. But one thing that might be the case is some third variable that explains this relationship, and it might not be these two variables that are that important. Final thing is when we describe the trend, right now we're just going to be describing it sort of roughly. We're going to be eyeballing it and sort of describing it. But we're going to learn how to describe it in a very precise, quantitative manner. And when we do that, that's going to be called finding the regression line. Because that really is going to be the equation of that line. And then we're also going to, right now, just describe the strength sort of roughly, but later we're going to find precise quantitative values for strength, and that's going to be called correlation. All right. Now let's move on to some more examples. So first, here's a graph, and what I want you to do is just identify those, to just go through those 5 steps of summarizing a scatter plot. So remember, it's describe the cases and the variables, talk about the shape, talk about the trend, talk about strength, and then think about potential explanations. So I'm going to introduce you to this thing called gapminder.org. It's this wonderful website that sort of puts together all these different databases of really interesting information from all over the world and puts it in beautiful graph form so that we can look at the data in new and very interesting ways. So here you could go to gapminder.org if you want. I've already pulled it up on my browser. And you want to click on, I think it's World, Gapminder World. I've actually clicked on Health and Wealth of Nations. And so if you want to follow along, you could do that too. But I want to show you this graph. Here, what we have on the bottom is income per person. So GDP per capita. So this is the entire amount of money that the economy of that nation makes divided by how many people are part of that nation, right? And so that's income per person on the x-axis. And notice that it's in log log form, that means that it's sort of spread out. The low numbers are sort of spread out and the higher numbers are sort of squished together because they've taken the log of the income per person. And also here we have life expectancy, so that's the average number of years that people live in this country. And so let's start with first things first. Step one, what are the cases? Well, these cases actually represent countries, and if you put your cursor over these dots, it'll tell you which country it is. And in Gapminder, one nice thing is that you know the population of that country just by the size of the dots. So all the dots are different sizes. So, and here it tells you the geographic regions. Yellow is the Americas. Red is East Asia. Purple or violet is sub-Saharan Africa. Green is the Middle East and Northern Africa. And orange is Europe and Central Asia. And so you could probably guess what this big red one is, China and also India. So those are sort of the big circles. If you want to find the United States, it's a yellow country, and we're quite wealthy, and we live quite a long time, right? So that's the United States. If you look behind it, there's Singapore, which is a very small country, but they're very rich, high GDP per capita, so high income per person, but also high in life expectancy. India is sort of roughly in the middle of the pack, where it's sort of medium in terms of income, but also medium in terms of life expectancy. One thing you might notice is that sub-Saharan Africa is sort of clustered down here, where many of these countries have relatively low income per person and also relatively low life expectancy compared to these other countries. You could also see that Europe is sort of clustered all up here. The Americas are also sort of all up in there, as well as Asia. That's also sort of up on the higher end of this. And so immediately we see this positive association, right? So we see this positive association, and it seems roughly linear, maybe a little bit curved, but roughly linear. And another wonderful thing about Gapminder, although we won't really be talking about it that much today, is that it has this data from 1800 all the way to 2000. So if you hit this play button, it'll actually play for you how this scatter plot came about over time, where you see a lot of countries. We started off with very, very low population numbers. All our dots are relatively small, but the dots will grow and our GDP will grow, and at the same time our life expectancy will grow. So you see that European countries are sort of ahead of the pack. Africa's down here. China, right, it's growing faster in terms of life expectancy, and then the GDP sort of catches up with it. And then finally we end up with 2009, which is apparently when this data goes up until. Another thing that you could do with this graph, with this visualization, is that you could pick a particular country that you might be interested in. So let's say we're very interested in, Azerbaijan, right? And we could look at just how Azerbaijan changes over time, and it'll keep a running track of how Azerbaijan is growing in terms of their GDP as well as their life expectancy. So this is just a really wonderful graph, and you could look at lots of different kinds of variables for these nations. But let's answer our 5 questions, getting back to more statistics things. So the first thing is that these are nations, right, that are represented, and it's their income per person by life expectancy. Right? So that's the first thing. We've figured out what the cases are and what the variables are. The second thing is the shape. We'll say roughly linear, right? Maybe a little bit curved. we've seen some clusters of these, we've seen some of these geographic clusters, but not really in terms of the actual dots. If you thought of these all as just black dots, they would create roughly this line. Now let's talk about the trend. The trend definitely seems to be a positive association. So as GDP is greater, life expectancy is also greater. As GDP is lower, life expectancy is also lower. So they're linked in this positive way, not oppositely linked. And let's talk about spread. We could imagine a line and see somewhat of a spread. I would say maybe this is a moderate spread. I mean, it's not like you see a perfect line, but it's not like so spread out you can't see the line either. So maybe moderate might be a good answer for that. And number 5, let's think about why this might be. Well, we want to consider a couple of things when we think about the relationship between these two variables. We want to think about how variable 1 might impact variable 2, but we also want to think about how variable 2 might impact variable 1. And finally, we might want to think about how some third variable, variable 3, the mystery variable, might impact both 1 and 2, right? So we might think, okay, if you have a higher income per person, if you're a richer country, you have better health care, better facilities, better sanitation, right? So you might have greater life expectancy. Also, if you have greater life expectancy, you could invest in more education and more long-term things, and because of that, that might increase income per person. You might be able to share more cultural capital, who knows, right? Or it might be some third variable. Maybe a government that governs so well that you have this great income also has good health care and other things to have great life expectancy, right? So it might be, or different things. Or maybe like some countries have war, right? So if you have a lot of war, then your economy suffers, but also life expectancy suffers, right? And so that's like a third variable, right? So it might be a whole bunch of different things. So here, it's such a long answer, we're not going to write it down, but you want to think about all the different ways that they might impact each other.